The first sign that Queen Seralyne was losing patience with the Royal Advisory Council was not visible in her face. Valorian monarchs were trained from childhood to remain composed through assassination attempts, diplomatic insults, funerals, coronations, and 12-hour trade negotiations conducted by species that communicated primarily through scent. Seralyne could therefore sit beneath the silver branches of the throne chamber, one hand resting calmly on the arm of her chair, while 11 advisors explained why her continued widowhood had become a matter of interstellar security. Only the slight movement of her long ears betrayed her irritation. "Your Majesty," Chancellor Othrin said carefully, "the Eastern systems require reassurance. They have 3 fleets, 7 defense moons, and enough antimatter to remove a small constellation," Seralyne replied. "How much reassurance does one require?" Othrin hesitated. "Apparently a husband." Princess Liora covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Seralyne glanced toward her daughter, who sat several steps below the throne, swinging her feet beneath a ceremonial chair designed for someone twice her size. The 8-year-old princess looked almost exactly like her mother in miniature, from the dark silver hair to the long Valorian ears, though Liora possessed none of Seralyne's talent for hiding her thoughts. "That was not funny," Seralyne said. "I know," Liora whispered. This made it considerably worse. A holographic galaxy rotated above the council table. Hundreds of inhabited systems shone like dust suspended in black water, joined by pale lines representing wormhole corridors, military treaties, trade routes, and complicated political arrangements that seemed to multiply whenever Seralyne slept. Admiral Vesson touched the projection, opening a series of profiles. After 18 months of analysis, the Crown Compatibility Engine has identified 37 potential consorts. Seralyne stared at him. "You used the Crown Intelligence Network to find me a husband?" "Only a portion of it." "How comforting." Liora leaned toward her mother. "Can the machine find me a pet?" "Probably faster." The advisors pretended not to hear. Seralyne rose and walked toward the hologram. Faces appeared one after another. Princes, admirals, governors, genetic heirs of ancient houses. Every candidate came accompanied by biological compatibility percentages, political projections, military advantages, and estimates of how many rebellions might be prevented by marrying them. Not one profile contained the question Seralyne actually cared about. Would this person be kind to Liora? 4 years had passed since King Avaren's death aboard the battleship Valiant Star. 4 years since Seralyne had watched his vessel disappear inside the burning atmosphere of Calaris, while 3 billion citizens expected their queen to remain strong. She had remained strong, perhaps too successfully. Now strength had become another duty nobody allowed her to put down. "I will review the candidates tomorrow," she said. The council visibly relaxed. Seralyne raised a finger. "Review, not marry." Their relief disappeared. She left before anyone could negotiate with the wording. Far below the royal chambers, where polished stone became exposed alloy and ceremonial silence gave way to the vibration of machinery, Daniel Mercer had no idea that 37 powerful men were preparing to compete for the queen. He was currently losing an argument with a ventilation unit. "You are broken." The maintenance terminal flashed. "System function. Optimal." Daniel stared at it. "You are literally on fire." "System. Function. Optimal." A thin curl of smoke emerged from the wall. Daniel folded his arms. "I admire the confidence." Behind him came a familiar giggle. He turned and found Princess Liora standing in the doorway with 2 royal security drones hovering anxiously behind her. Daniel sighed. "You escaped again." "I did not escape." "Your guards look traumatized." "They worry too much." One drone emitted a sharp warning tone. Liora pointed at it. "See?" Daniel crouched beside the ventilation panel and removed a burned quantum relay. Liora immediately sat cross-legged beside him. "What are you doing?" "Preventing your palace from becoming a very expensive oven." "Can I help?" "No." "Why?" "Because last time you helped, we accidentally removed gravity from Workshop 3. That was fun." "Technically, Yes. Daniel replaced the relay, and the smoke stopped. Liora studied him with the intense seriousness children reserved for questions adults usually regretted answering. Why don't you bow when you see me? Daniel looked at her. I bow. You bend your head. My knees are old. You are 38. Earth manufacturers provide limited warranties. Liora burst out laughing. The sound echoed through the maintenance corridor just as Seralyne entered from the opposite door. She stopped. For several seconds, Daniel did not notice her. Seralyne watched her daughter laughing beside the human engineer, surrounded by tools, cables, and dismantled machinery. Liora had attended banquets with emperors without smiling this openly. She had met heroes whose statues stood on entire moons. Yet somehow this ordinary human, with grease on his sleeve and a plasma wrench tucked behind one ear, had achieved what half the palace had failed to do. Daniel finally looked up. Oh. The security drones immediately lowered themselves in formal salute. Daniel attempted something similar, nearly dropped his wrench, caught it against his boot, and muttered something Seralyne suspected was not appropriate palace vocabulary. Liora laughed harder. Seralyne felt the corner of her mouth move despite herself. Daniel straightened. Your Majesty. Engineer Mercer. There was a pause. Daniel glanced at the open ventilation panel. If you're here about the smoke, technically the palace started it. Seralyne looked at her daughter, then at the human. For reasons she could not yet explain, the exhausting weight of the council chamber suddenly felt very far away. By the following morning, the palace had transformed into something Seralyne privately considered an interstellar livestock exhibition, disguised as diplomacy. 3 diplomatic cruisers hung above the capital's eastern towers, each one broadcasting ceremonial light patterns across the clouds. Security drones crowded the upper corridors. Servants carried crystalline banners from visiting houses Seralyne barely remembered approving, and somewhere beneath the throne level, a choir from the moon of Orivane had been rehearsing the same 6 notes for nearly an hour. Seralyne stood before the mirrored wall of her private chamber while 2 attendants fastened silver armor plates over the dark fabric of her formal gown. The armor was ceremonial, not practical, though it could still stop a plasma bolt at 30 meters. Liora sat on the edge of the bed. Do you have to marry one today? No. Tomorrow? No. Next week? Seralyne looked at her reflection. If you continue asking, possibly never. Liora seemed pleased with that answer. The first candidate arrived beneath a procession of floating banners. Prince Kalor of the Helian Reach was handsome in the mathematically irritating way produced by generations of genetic selection. His skin was flawless, his posture exact, his ceremonial jacket woven with living metallic fibers that shifted color according to his heartbeat. His compatibility score with Seralyne was 98.7%. The council considered this extraordinary. Seralyne considered it suspicious. Kalor bowed. Your Majesty, our union would strengthen both bloodlines and secure 3 strategic wormhole corridors. Liora whispered, He sounds like Chancellor Othrin. Seralyne kept smiling. Kalor continued, Our projected offspring would possess exceptional neurological potential. Leora's expression changed. Seralyne's smile became colder. We have known each other for 42 seconds, she said. Kalor blinked. Yes, Your Majesty. And you are already discussing hypothetical children. Genetically speaking. Do stop speaking genetically. Across the chamber, Chancellor Othrin closed his eyes. The next candidate was Admiral Theron, a decorated commander from the northern fleets. He entered wearing a black exoskeletal uniform capable of sealing itself against vacuum and immediately began commenting on the palace defenses. You have insufficient anti-orbital batteries on the southern towers. Seralyne stared at him. You came here to court me. Yes. And within 3 minutes you have criticized my artillery. I value honesty. Liora leaned toward her mother. I don't like him. Theron heard. Princess, I assure you I am excellent with children. Do you have any? No. Then how do you know? Daniel Mercer would later hear about this exchange from a palace guard and nearly choke on his coffee. By midday, Seralyne had survived 4 candidates, 2 ceremonial meals, 1 compatibility demonstration involving synchronized neural scans, and a speech about hereditary trade privileges long enough to qualify as a weapon. Liora escaped during candidate number 5. Naturally, Seralyne found her in Daniel's workshop. The human engineer was sitting beneath the suspended skeleton of a gravitic stabilizer, while Liora held a tiny magnetic vehicle in both hands. "It goes faster if I increase the field strength," Liora said. "It also explodes faster," Daniel replied. "That sounds exciting." "That is because you are 8. Seralyne entered quietly. Daniel was too busy calibrating a miniature propulsion coil to notice her. "What if we increase it only a little?" Liora asked. Daniel considered. "That is exactly how most engineering disasters begin." "Have you caused many?" "Professionally, I am required to say no." Seralyne laughed before she could stop herself. Daniel froze. Then he looked up. "Your Majesty, you appear to be teaching my daughter dangerous engineering. I prefer supervised experimentation." Liora lifted the little vehicle. "He said it might explode." Daniel sighed. "Context is a beautiful thing." Seralyne stepped closer to the workbench. The room smelled faintly of machine oil and ionized metal. Holographic schematics floated over the central table, showing the palace's lower power network in blue-white lines. Unlike the ceremonial halls above, nothing here had been designed to impress anyone. Seralyne found that strangely comforting. Daniel handed her a small tool. "Hold this." She stared at him. He was already reaching into the stabilizer assembly. "Engineer Mercer." "Yes?" "You just handed your queen a plasma wrench." Daniel looked at the tool, then at her. "Do queens not use those?" "No." "That explains several maintenance problems." Liora giggled. Seralyne should have been offended. Instead, she looked down at the wrench. "How?" Daniel blinked. "How what?" "How do I hold it?" He smiled, not mockingly, but with genuine surprise. "Like this." He adjusted her grip, then immediately stepped back as though suddenly remembering she controlled 14 star systems and several million armed personnel. Seralyne noticed. She also noticed that he had not bowed, praised her, complimented her beauty, mentioned her bloodline, or suggested that their hypothetical children might stabilize trade routes. He had simply assumed she could learn something useful. For the next 20 minutes, Queen Seralyne helped repair a damaged gravitic control unit, while her daughter raced a tiny magnetic vehicle around the floor. When the machine finally activated, the workshop lights brightened. Daniel nodded toward her. "Not bad. Not bad. For a beginner." Seralyne narrowed her eyes. Liora whispered loudly, "You should bow now." Daniel immediately bowed. Unfortunately, he still had the plasma wrench in his hand. It struck the workbench with a loud clang. Seralyne stared at him for one long second. Then she laughed again. And somewhere far above them, 33 remaining royal candidates waited beneath polished banners, unaware that the queen had just spent the happiest part of her day repairing machinery beside a human who had absolutely no idea he was becoming dangerous to their chances. By the 3rd day of the selection, Seralyne had begun to suspect that the crown compatibility engine had been designed by someone who had never actually liked another person. The machine was flawless at measuring genetic stability, political influence, strategic value, hereditary health, financial resources, military strength, neural compatibility, and even projected lifespan overlap. It could estimate with frightening precision how many trade agreements a marriage might secure over the next 50 years. What it could not determine was whether a man became unbearable after 10 minutes. Seralyne discovered this omission repeatedly. The morning began with Lord Varek of the Luthen Consortium, who arrived wearing a cloak threaded with microscopic drones that continuously rearranged themselves into the symbols of his family holdings. Entire moons apparently belonged to him. Several orbital shipyards did too. Liora stared at the moving patterns on his cloak. Does your clothing advertise you? Varric smiled indulgently. It represents prosperity. It looks nervous. Seralyne lowered her cup to hide her mouth. Varric continued as if nothing had happened. My union with your majesty could integrate the Dominion into the largest commercial network in the Western Spiral. Could it? Seralyne asked. Our combined influence would be unprecedented. And what would you want from me? He seemed surprised by the question. Your majesty. As a person. Silence. Varric smiled again, but this time it took slightly longer. I admire your strength. So does my security chief. I admire your intelligence. So does my chief scientist. I admire your beauty. That is what the sculptors say when requesting payment. Liora coughed into her sleeve. Across the table, Chancellor Othrin looked as if he were reconsidering retirement. The afternoon became worse. A prince from the Tellurian League demonstrated his suitability through a synchronized neural simulation, insisting that compatibility could be proven by shared responses to emotional stimuli. Seralyne reluctantly entered the simulation chamber. The world dissolved around her. One moment she stood inside the palace laboratory. The next, she was on a fabricated beach beneath 3 artificial suns while the prince walked beside her. This environment reflects our projected psychological harmony, he explained. Seralyne looked at the perfectly arranged waves. It is very symmetrical. Exactly. I dislike it. The prince stopped. You dislike beaches? I dislike simulations that tell me what I'm supposed to feel. The program immediately produced a compatibility warning. Liora, watching from outside the chamber, laughed so hard that a technician had to ask her to step away from the controls. By evening, Seralyne had spoken with 9 candidates and wanted to speak with none of them ever again. She escaped to one of the palace observation balconies, where the floating capital stretched beneath her like an illuminated constellation. Atmospheric traffic moved between towers and glowing streams. Far below, the planet's violet oceans reflected the light of 2 moons. She heard footsteps behind her. Daniel stopped when he saw her. I can leave. No. He hesitated. Seralyne turned toward him. You may stay. Daniel carried a diagnostic pad beneath one arm and 2 cups in his hands. He lifted one. Coffee? She looked suspiciously at it. Human coffee? Yes. I have been warned about human coffee. By whom? Medical staff. That seems excessive. She accepted the cup. The first taste was bitter enough to qualify as an attack. Seralyne stared at Daniel. This is terrible. You get used to it. Why? Tradition. She laughed softly and leaned against the balcony rail. For several minutes they said nothing. It was strangely easy. Daniel finally looked toward the palace towers. Busy day? You could say that. How many future husbands? 9. He nearly spilled his coffee. 9 today? Do not sound impressed. I'm impressed you didn't declare war. The evening is young. Daniel smiled. Seralyne studied him. What did you do before coming here? He looked surprised. Engineering. Before that. Daniel turned his cup slowly between his hands. Exploration ships. Human frontier service. Mostly damaged stations, failed colonies, emergency repair work. Places where people only noticed engineers when something was already on fire. That sounds dangerous. It was mostly paperwork. She raised an eyebrow. You are lying. Only partially. He told her about crossing unstable wormhole corridors and repairing life support systems while ships shook apart around him. He spoke without pride, as though surviving impossible situations had simply been another form of maintenance. Seralyne listened. You never mention any of this at court. I'm not at court. You were standing in the throne hall yesterday. I was fixing a temperature regulator, while 3 ambassadors were present. They were warmer afterward. She smiled. Then she asked the question she had been wondering about since the workshop. Why do you never try to impress me? Daniel looked genuinely confused. Should I? Most people do. He considered that. I suppose repairing machinery is difficult enough without also trying to impress monarchs. Seralyne laughed. A real laugh. Too sudden. Too loud. A tiny, humiliating sound escaped at the end. She froze. Daniel politely looked toward the sky. Did you just pretend not to hear that? Yes. Engineer Mercer. I value continued employment. For a moment, Seralyne could not breathe from laughing. When the laughter faded, something remained between them. Not romance. Not yet. Comfort. Then Daniel's diagnostic pad emitted a warning tone. His expression changed immediately. He opened the display. A holographic diagram of the palace power network appeared between them. One section deep beneath the royal complex pulsed red. Seralyne noticed. What is it? Daniel enlarged the reading. Probably nothing. She gave him a look. Humans say that when something is definitely not nothing. Fair. He studied the numbers. The quantum reactor is producing irregular gravitic harmonics. Is that dangerous? It shouldn't be possible. That was not my question. Daniel's humor vanished. Yes. The wind moved across the balcony. Far below them, the palace lights flickered once. Only once. But Daniel saw it. So did Seralyne. And somewhere beneath kilometers of ancient alloy, the heart of the royal palace began to pulse in a rhythm no machine had been designed to make. The palace began to fall during dinner. At first, nobody understood what was happening. The crystal chandeliers above the royal hall trembled, then tilted toward the eastern wall as the artificial gravity shifted by several degrees. Wine slid across polished tables. Holographic banners distorted into ribbons of static. Somewhere beneath the floor came a low vibration so deep Seralyne felt it through her bones. Then the gravity failed completely. Guests rose from their chairs without meaning to. A silver serving tray floated past Chancellor Othrin's face. Liora grabbed the edge of the table. Prince Kalor collided gracefully with a decorative column, which Seralyne would later consider the most useful thing he had done all week. "Emergency stabilization!" someone shouted. The palace answered with darkness. For 3 seconds, the entire royal hall vanished into blackness. Then red emergency lights flickered on. Daniel was already moving. He had been standing near the rear service entrance, officially present because one of the environmental regulators had begun malfunctioning again. Unofficially, he had been watching the reactor readings on his diagnostic pad since sunset. Now every warning indicator had turned red. "Everyone stay away from the windows," he shouted. Admiral Theron snapped toward him. "Engineer, you do not command this hall." Daniel pointed toward the enormous window behind him. A crack of blue energy crawled across the defensive shield outside. "I recommend arguing after the palace stops dropping out of the sky." The floor slammed back beneath them. People crashed into chairs, tables, and one another. Seralyne landed hard but remained standing. "How bad?" Daniel looked at the display. "Define bad." Daniel. He paused. The primary gravitic core is losing synchronization with the quantum reactor. The floating foundations are compensating, but they can't do it for long. How long? Maybe 20 minutes. Othrin went pale. The palace floated nearly 3 kilometers above the capital. 20 minutes was not comforting. Evacuation alarms began screaming through the corridors. Security officers surrounded Seralyne and Liora immediately. "We must move you to the royal shuttle." "No," Seralyne said. "Your Majesty, how many workers are below the reactor level?" A technician answered through the emergency channel. 216. Seralyne looked at Daniel. "Can they escape?" "Not if the lower lifts are dead." "Then I am not leaving." 3 advisors protested at once. Several marriage candidates did not. Kalor was already speaking urgently to his personal guard about reaching his cruiser. Seralyne noticed. So did Liora. The child frowned. "He runs very efficiently." Seralyne almost smiled. Daniel looked at her. "If you're coming below, you follow my instructions." The room became silent. Othrin stared at him in horror. You cannot order the Queen. Daniel looked toward the shaking ceiling. The reactor does not appear concerned with constitutional etiquette. Seralyne stepped toward him. Lead the way. The descent into the lower palace was nothing like the ceremonial levels above. They climbed through emergency shafts, illuminated by strips of white maintenance light, while machinery groaned around them. Seralyne had removed her ceremonial cloak and crown. Daniel carried 2 plasma cutters, a portable field generator, and enough tools to make his belt look like a small engineering accident. They reached Reactor Access 7 just as another gravity wave struck. Seralyne slammed against the wall. Daniel caught her arm. You all right? I have had better dinners. Dessert was probably ruined. That is your concern? It was excellent dessert. She laughed despite the alarms. Then the reactor chamber opened before them. A sphere of compressed blue-white energy hung at the center of an enormous magnetic cage. Rings of ancient Valorian machinery rotated around it at impossible speeds. Lightning crawled between gravitic pylons. Daniel stared. That's not a reactor. Seralyne looked at him. What do you mean? It's reacting to the quantum network like it's trying to communicate with it. A technician shook her head. That system predates the network by 6 centuries. Exactly. Daniel ran toward the control platform. The holographic interface was useless, flooded with contradictory data. So he did something that made every Valorian engineer in the chamber stare. He opened the physical access panel. You're bypassing the quantum controls? One technician asked. Yes. With manual relays? Yes. That technology is primitive. Daniel looked back. So is gravity. Still annoying. Seralyne joined him at the panel. What do you need? He handed her a conductor clamp. Hold this against the phase rail. She stared at the sparking assembly. That appears unsafe. It is. You have an alarming way of building confidence. Together, they forced the ancient system into manual synchronization. Seralyne held the conductor while Daniel rewired 3 gravitic relays directly into the backup field generator. The chamber shook. A burst of energy threw sparks across the platform. Daniel shouted, "Now!" Seralyne slammed the clamp into place. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then the reactor rings slowed. The screaming alarms stopped. Across the city, the floating palace stabilized. Silence filled the chamber. Daniel exhaled. Seralyne looked at her ruined sleeves, blackened gloves, and grease across her royal armor. Is this how humans normally repair things? No. She waited. Usually there's more swearing. A voice came from the doorway. Mother. Liora ran into the chamber before anyone could stop her. She collided with Seralyne first, then grabbed Daniel around the waist. For once, neither adult knew what to say. Daniel awkwardly lifted one hand. Seralyne looked down at her daughter, then at the human beside her. Above them, the palace remained steady. And for the first time since Project Consort had begun, Seralyne understood the difference between a man selected because he looked perfect in a database and a man who ran toward danger when everyone else was looking for an exit. The palace was still being repaired when the Royal Advisory Council decided, with astonishing determination, that finding Seralyne a husband remained an urgent priority. Seralyne discovered this while standing in a corridor where half the wall had been removed to expose a damaged gravitic conduit. You cannot be serious, she said. Chancellor Othrin adjusted his robe. Your Majesty, political obligations remain. The palace nearly fell 3 kilometers. Yes. 200 people were trapped below the reactor. Yes. One of the west towers is currently being held upright by emergency field generators. Othrin hesitated. Also, yes. And your conclusion is that I need dinner with more men? The candidates have already traveled considerable distances. Seralyne stared at him until even his long ears lowered slightly. Behind them, Daniel was inside the open wall with only his boots visible. His voice came from the conduit. For what it is worth, Chancellor, I also think this is a terrible idea. Othrin looked offended. You were not included in this conversation. That has never stopped engineers. Seralyne almost smiled. The final banquet took place that evening in a smaller hall because the main ceremonial chamber still contained a hole large enough to park a shuttle inside. The remaining candidates sat beneath floating chandeliers powered by temporary fusion cells while diplomatic drones hovered along the ceiling. Seralyne wore a simple silver gown rather than royal armor. Liora sat beside her, unusually quiet. Daniel was not supposed to be present. Unfortunately, the temperature regulator failed 10 minutes before dinner. He arrived carrying a diagnostic scanner and a toolkit. Lord Varric glanced toward him with mild irritation. Must maintenance personnel work during the meal? Daniel looked at the flickering environmental panel. Only if everyone prefers oxygen. Varric stopped talking. Liora smiled. The dinner began badly and deteriorated with impressive efficiency. Prince Kalor presented Seralyne with a genetic projection showing what their future children might look like at different ages. Seralyne stared at the holographic infants floating above the table. You generated imaginary children. Our compatibility is exceptional. Liora leaned closer to the projection. That one looks angry. Kalor frowned. It is a statistical model. It still looks angry. The hologram vanished. Admiral Theron then proposed merging several Vylorian military commands with his own forces, if the marriage proceeded. Seralyne listened politely. When he finished, Liora asked, "What is Mother's favorite food?" Theron blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Her favorite food." "I do not know." Liora turned to Varric. "Do you?" He smiled uncertainly. "I am sure I would learn." "Her favorite music?" Silence. "Her favorite place in the palace?" No answer. Seralyne shifted in her chair. "Liora." But the girl continued. "If Mother were not queen, would you still want to marry her?" That changed the room. No candidate answered immediately. The silence became uncomfortable enough that even the service drones seemed to move more quietly. Finally, Kalor said, "Her Majesty cannot be separated from her position." Liora frowned. "That was not what I asked." Seralyne looked at her daughter differently. The child was not trying to embarrass anyone. She genuinely wanted to understand. Chancellor Othran attempted to rescue the evening. "Perhaps the princess might tell us which candidate has made the strongest impression." Liora looked around the table, then past it. Her eyes stopped at the far wall. Daniel was standing on a maintenance platform, halfway inside the environmental control housing. Liora raised one small hand. "Him." Daniel slowly pulled his head out of the panel. The room froze. Othran looked behind himself, as if hoping another person had entered. Liora pointed again. "Daniel." Daniel's scanner slipped from his hand and hit the platform with a metallic clang. Seralyne felt heat rise into her face. "Liora." "What?" "You cannot simply choose. He is better." Several candidates stared at the human engineer as though he had personally invaded their home systems. Daniel climbed down from the platform very slowly. "I would like to formally state that I was repairing a temperature regulator." Nobody responded. He looked at Seralyne. "I feel that fact may become important." Liora crossed her arms. "They all came because Mother is queen." Othran opened his mouth. Liora continued before he could stop her. "Daniel came because the room was cold." Silence again. This time Seralyne could not dismiss it so easily. Her daughter looked toward her. "He makes you laugh." Seralyne's long ears flushed. "Liora. He listens to me. He helped the workers. He stayed when everyone else ran away." Kalor stiffened. "I did not run." Liora looked at him. "You left very quickly." Daniel coughed into his hand. Seralyne wanted the floor to open beneath her. Unfortunately, the palace had suffered enough structural damage for 1 week. The dinner ended soon afterward. Seralyne dismissed the council, the candidates, and eventually even Liora, though the girl left with the satisfied expression of someone who believed she had solved an unnecessarily complicated adult problem. Hours later, Seralyne stood alone before the Crown compatibility engine. Candidate profiles floated around her. Genetic stability, military power, political influence, wealth, longevity, intelligence. She searched the system. Display kindness. The machine responded. Parameter not recognized. Loyalty without political incentive. Parameter not recognized. Patience with children. Parameter not recognized. Seralyne stared at the cold blue interface. Then she laughed softly. Of course, the most advanced royal matchmaking system in the galaxy could calculate the probability of civil unrest 40 years into the future. But it had never been programmed to measure whether someone would crawl into a burning reactor because strangers needed help. The doors opened quietly behind her. Daniel stood there. I was told you wanted to see me. Seralyne looked at him for a long moment. For once, she had no prepared royal response, and that frightened her far more than any compatibility score ever had. Daniel entered the chamber slowly, as though approaching a malfunctioning reactor rather than a queen who had just spent an hour asking a machine whether kindness existed. Seralyne dismissed the floating candidate profiles with a gesture, but not before Daniel caught sight of several unfamiliar faces suspended in blue light. I assume none of them repair temperature regulators, he said. Seralyne gave him a tired look. Apparently that skill was not included in the genetic screening. He smiled, then noticed her expression and stopped. What happened? She looked toward the dormant compatibility engine. I asked it questions it could not answer. Daniel leaned against the edge of the console. Machines hate that. Do humans? Constantly. We just pretend otherwise. Before Seralyne could reply, the chamber lights flickered. Not like the reactor failure. This was deliberate. A second later, the doors sealed with a heavy metallic impact. Daniel straightened. That is new. The palace network came alive around them, but instead of the usual silver interface, red security symbols spread across the walls. System override. Internal lockdown. Seralyne touched her wrist communicator. Nothing. Royal command channel is dead. Daniel was already pulling out his diagnostic pad. Someone isolated the palace network. Can they do that? Someone just did. A distorted voice sounded through the chamber. Remain where you are, Your Majesty. Seralyne's face hardened instantly. Daniel glanced at her. Friend? No. Good. I was worried palace etiquette had become even stranger. Security alerts began appearing across his pad. Restricted doors locking, defense drones changing command authority, communications to the fleet cut. Somewhere above them, weapons fire crackled briefly through the walls. Seralyne moved toward the sealed entrance. Liora. Daniel checked the map. She's in the eastern residential wing. Then we go there. He looked at the armored door. Unless Your Majesty has been secretly carrying explosives in that gown, I suggest another route. 5 minutes later, the Queen of the Valorian Dominion was crawling behind Daniel through an emergency maintenance shaft. This is becoming a habit, she muttered. You're improving. That sounded dangerously like praise. Don't get used to it. They reached a service junction overlooking the central security hub. Below, palace guards had been disarmed by automated defense drones. Standing beside the control platform was Prince Kaelor. Seralyne went completely still. Daniel whispered, I'm guessing his courtship strategy has changed. Kaelor was speaking to several armed Helian soldiers. The Queen will remain unharmed. Once the Council understands the scale of the instability, they will accept emergency protection. Seralyne's expression turned cold. He knew. About the reactor, Daniel asked. She nodded. His fleet offered military support before the failure. Daniel studied the security data. Then he noticed a familiar encryption signature buried inside the network override. He frowned. He did more than know. What? Someone installed a hidden command package inside the quantum network months ago. It exaggerated the reactor instability and delayed automatic containment. Seralyne stared at him. He caused it? Not entirely. The reactor already had a flaw. He made sure it became a disaster. For the first time, her anger overcame royal composure. To force me into dependence on him. Daniel nodded. Romantic. They moved quickly. Daniel rerouted old maintenance drones through a forgotten analog control system disconnected from the palace network. Within minutes, tiny repair units began crawling through ventilation shafts carrying improvised signal disruptors. Seralyne watched him work. You are weaponizing cleaning machines. Technically, maintenance machines. That distinction comforts me enormously. One by one, the hostile defense drones below lost synchronization and dropped harmlessly to the floor. Daniel opened the access hatch. Now. Seralyne descended first. Kaelor turned just as she stepped into the security hub. His confidence vanished. Your Majesty, you concealed a reactor threat, sabotaged palace systems, and endangered my daughter. I was protecting the Dominion. From what? Weakness. Daniel dropped from the shaft behind her. You nearly dropped the palace onto the capital. Kaelor glared at him. This does not concern you, human. Daniel looked around. I'm standing in the room, so statistically it does. Kaelor reached for a sidearm. Seralyne was faster. A pulse from her wrist shield struck his hand and sent the weapon spinning across the floor. Loyal palace guards rushed in moments later as Daniel restored internal communications. The coup ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Seralyne barely waited for reports before heading toward Liora's quarters. She found the princess hiding behind an overturned table with 2 security officers and a small emergency blaster clutched in both hands. The instant Liora saw them, she dropped it and ran forward. Seralyne caught her first. Daniel stopped several steps away, but Liora reached out and grabbed his sleeve, pulling him into the embrace whether he was ready or not. Later, after Kaelor and his allies had been taken into custody, Seralyne found Daniel alone on the same observation balcony where he had first warned her about the reactor. You saved the palace again, she said. I had help. What do you want? He looked confused. For what? For everything. Wealth, rank, land, a royal position. Daniel considered this with exaggerated seriousness. Permission to replace the reactor before it develops another personality disorder. Seralyne stared at him. Then she laughed. That is all? Maybe better coffee in the engineering wing. Her laughter faded slowly. You truly want nothing from the throne. Daniel looked at her, and for once there was no joke waiting. I don't know the throne. Seralyne's breath caught. I know you. Neither spoke for several seconds. Later that night, Liora found her mother sitting beside the window. You like him, she said. Seralyne sighed. You are becoming intolerably observant. You smile differently around Daniel. Do I? Yes. Liora climbed beside her. With everyone else, you smile like a queen. Seralyne looked down at her daughter. And with Daniel? Liora grinned. Like mother. For the first time, Seralyne stopped trying to argue. By sunrise, the palace had become quiet in a way Seralyne had never known before. Not peaceful. Too many repair crews still moved through the lower levels. Too many security teams were questioning prisoners. Too many damaged systems blinked beneath emergency power, but quiet in the places that mattered. The surviving marriage candidates had already begun leaving the capital. Prince Kaelor and the officers who had supported him were confined aboard a military transport under heavy guard, their encrypted communications now part of an investigation that reached across 3 systems. The Royal Advisory Council gathered one final time beneath the half-repaired ceiling of the western chamber, where exposed conduits glowed behind temporary shielding. Seralyne stood before them without ceremonial armor. Project Consort is terminated, she said. Chancellor Othrin folded his hands carefully. Your Majesty, the political consequences will be handled politically. And the succession concerns will be handled by people rather than algorithms. Othrin glanced toward the dormant compatibility engine. The system was designed to protect the stability of the Dominion. It nearly helped hand the Dominion to a man who thought sabotage was courtship. Nobody argued with that. Seralyne stepped closer to the council table. You measured bloodlines, fleets, wealth, genetics, longevity, and influence. You measured everything except character. Her voice softened. I allowed it because I was afraid. Afraid that wanting something for myself was selfish. Afraid that being a mother and queen meant every choice had to belong to the throne. She looked around the chamber. That ends now. One by one, the candidate files disappeared from the holographic display. 37 carefully calculated futures vanished into darkness. Liora, seated near the doors, whispered to Othrin, "Does this mean I won?" Othrin looked exhausted. "Princess, I am increasingly concerned that you believe government is a competitive activity." "Isn't it?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Seralyne hid a smile. She found Daniel hours later where she should have expected to find him, inside the reactor chamber, arguing with 3 Valorian engineers about replacing a 600-year-old gravitic regulator. The main quantum core now floated behind new containment fields, its once violent blue energy reduced to a steady pulse. "That component is historically significant," one engineer protested. Daniel held up the cracked regulator. "So is plague. We still try not to keep it in the ventilation system." Seralyne entered just as the engineers reluctantly carried the part away. Daniel noticed her and immediately wiped grease from his hands onto a cloth. "Your Majesty, you know, after everything that has happened, I had hoped you might stop sounding surprised whenever I appear. I'm an engineer. Unexpected variables concern me." "Am I an unexpected variable?" "Frequently." She almost laughed, but this time she had come for something more difficult than humor. "Walk with me." They crossed the lower gardens, where artificial sunlight filtered through transparent shield panels, repaired after the crisis. Small maintenance drones moved between silver-leafed trees, restoring irrigation lines. Daniel waited without questioning her. That patience made what she wanted to say both easier and harder. At last, Seralyne stopped beside the observation terrace overlooking the floating capital. She removed the silver crown from her head. Daniel stared at it. "Should I be worried?" "Probably. That is never reassuring." She placed the crown on the railing between them. "I have spent years speaking as Queen first and Seralyne second." Daniel said nothing. "I do not want to do that now." Her long ears shifted slightly with nervousness, and she hated that he probably noticed. "Liora believes I should marry you." Daniel coughed. "Yes, she has made her position alarmingly clear. She is wrong." His face changed almost imperceptibly. Seralyne continued before he could misunderstand. "She is wrong because marriage should not be ordered by a princess, predicted by a machine, or negotiated by advisors." Daniel's expression eased. "That sounds reasonable. I want to know what happens if we choose for ourselves." The city lights reflected in his eyes. "What exactly are you asking?" Seralyne breathed slowly. "Dinner." Daniel blinked. "Dinner? Do not make me regret this. I'm just confirming. No genetic projections, no treaty negotiations. None. No synchronized neural beach?" She stared at him. "Never mention that again." He smiled. "Then yes." She felt something inside her release, something that had been tight for 4 years. "Yes? Yes, Seralyne." It was the first time he had said her name without a title. She looked at him sharply. That sounded dangerously informal. "I can bow if necessary." "Please don't. Your knees are apparently defective." Daniel laughed. Months passed. The damaged reactor was replaced by a hybrid human-Valorian system using redundant mechanical controls alongside quantum management, an arrangement Daniel described as advanced technology supervised by switches that actually do what you tell them. The council hated the phrase and approved the design unanimously. Kaylor's conspiracy collapsed under investigation, exposing several officers and diplomats who had manipulated the marriage crisis to gain influence over the throne. The Eastern systems, rather than rebelling as the advisors feared, signed a revised defense pact after Seralyne personally negotiated terms without offering herself as part of the agreement. Daniel became Royal Chief Engineer only after refusing 3 more impressive titles. Liora claimed this proved he was bad at promotions. One evening, the 3 of them sat together on the high balcony above the capital. No council, no candidates, no ceremonial guards within hearing distance. Liora was building another magnetic racing vehicle from parts Daniel had specifically told her not to touch. Seralyne noticed and raised an eyebrow. "Is that safe?" Daniel studied the device. "No." Liora grinned. "Good." Seralyne laughed and leaned back in her chair. Far beyond the balcony, starships crossed the violet sky, their engines leaving pale lines above the floating towers. Daniel sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The crown rested on a table nearby, temporarily forgotten. Seralyne looked at her daughter, then at the human who had never asked for anything she owned. She had spent years believing that strength meant carrying every burden alone. Now she understood something different. Strength could also mean allowing someone to stand beside you without demanding that they kneel. Liora looked between them. "So when are you getting married?" Daniel nearly dropped his cup. Seralyne closed her eyes. "Liora." "What?" "Go finish your vehicle." "That is not an answer," Daniel whispered. "She would make a terrifying chancellor." Seralyne smiled. "Do not give her ideas." Beneath them, the palace reactor hummed steadily. The capital shone, and for the first time in years, the future did not feel like something Seralyne had to survive. It felt like something she was finally allowed to choose.